Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Preview of the episodes 29 to 32, Tit for Tat. Episode 29, Game Theory. So in this episode, I want to talk about a topic that is you rather see not in the natural sciences, although it also occurs there, especially in biology and more than that in evolutionary biology. But it's most present in today's science, or in today's age. We see it most often happening in economics. And therefore, this topic, when I was studying it, the lecture where I studied this was actually an economics lecture where we learned about this. And this area of research, or this field of research, is called game theory. So before we start getting into it, it's a really interesting topic, and I really enjoyed it very much to learn about these things. And before we start with learning what is game theory, what is this all about, I think we need to understand what is meant by games in this context. And when you would refer to a game, usually you would think of basically games like cardboard games, or so board games or card games, or even games like football and so on. But mostly you would not think of real life situations. It would be something simulated, something where you play something. And this can also be covered by game theory. So the decisions you make in those games can also be interesting research for game theorists. But it is the term game that is used in game theory is much broader. Basically, it covers every kind of decision making that is needed for reasonable human beings. So, if the assumption is always that a rationally thinking human, how he would decide in certain situations, and then you can look at a simulation. What is the outcome of the simulation, depending on the decision of others. And this is a really interesting topic. So because every day in your everyday life, you are confronted with such situations where you need to decide which course of action you choose, and also in many times the course of action you choose is not only dependent on what you do, or the result of the course of action you choose is not always dependent on what you do, but what others are doing as well. And we will see this in a bit. So just to remember, it's not, when we are talking about game theory, it's not just about how to win the games that I play with my friends, or the online games or whatever. So it's really about real life decisions that come also into play in there. And as we will see later, also very important in politics and in foreign policy, how nations interact with each other, which strategies do they take, and so on. So it's a really important topic, has really many applications. And so let's dive in. And what I want to start with to illustrate this, and instead of giving you the abstract theory, I just give you an illustration of which is used often. There are examples that are easy to understand and which basically cover most of the concepts of game theory, most of the issues where you have there, and the results you can achieve from there. And the thing that is again and again used in there is the so-called prisoner's dilemma. And what is this all about? So let's say we have two criminals, and they committed a crime, and the police caught them. But they have not enough evidence to get them into jail right away. And so they try to get a confession out of them. To do this, they interrogate them separately and give them the decision to basically to talk, to confess, or to be silent, to not say anything. And both criminals basically know that if they both remain silent, then they will both go to jail for 2 years because police has a little bit of evidence, and this is enough to get them into jail for 2 years. But if one of them is confessing and the other one remains silent, then the one who remains silent will get the full jail time, which was 10 years. And the one who was confessing, he will get free immediately because he showed that he was the one who was confessing and so on, and so he will get this kind of deal. And if both are confessing, then they will both get 5 years of jail. So in this case, you now are confronted with how to make the best decision for yourselves. And it turns out that in basically all cases, they would decide to both confess, because this is the only stable solution. Because if you stay silent, if you say, okay, I will stay silent and I hope that the other one will also remain silent, then the problem is that if he does not, you will go to jail for 10 years. So this is the worst outcome for you. And if you remain silent and the other one too, then it's a better outcome, but then you will go to jail for 2 years. And if you would have talked, if you would have confessed, then you would have gone free immediately. So in both cases, you are best off if you are talking, if you are confessing. No matter what the other one, what your partner in crime is doing, no matter what he's doing, you would be better off if you would just be confessing. And that's what is called a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy basically means that no matter how the other person involved will react, no matter what he or she will do, it will result in you getting the best outcome in this very situation. And the situation where both are confessing is then called so-called Nash equilibrium. And this is named after the mathematician John Nash. He was a mathematician who was working especially on this game theoretic things and theorems. And in his later life, he became schizophrenic, so he had to deal with this a lot. There's also a movie about him, A Beautiful Mind, it is called. And after him, this is named. And this Nash equilibrium is basically what one would expect to happen if everyone is acting rationally. Because if everyone is acting naturally in this case, then one would say, okay, we are both confessing, and so or each individually says, I will confess, and so I have to go after the dominant strategy, and therefore both are confessing and will both yield 5 years of jail. Now, as you can see, this is a lot worse than if both would have remained silent. Then they would have, if you put it together, if you consider them collectively, then they would both have, as a collective have had a better result. And that's the dilemma part. That's the part that is kind of bad, as you might think about it. But it is you have to understand that this is not a stable solution, because everyone who would, if one would have remained silent, then you would also always have to have in mind that the other one could possibly be confessing, and then you would go to jail for 10 years, and this would be really bad for you. So everyone decides, okay, even if the other one is confessing too, 5 years are a lot better than 10 years, so I will decide to do this one. And therefore, a solution which is actually not the best one for them as a collective is the only one that has an equilibrium that is basically can turn out, because it would be in their best rational decision individually to decide this way. So this is the interesting part about this. And such games that I described before, where the action of one will the profit of one will result in a negative profit of the other, as it is usually the case in such games. Such games are called zero-sum games. So you might have heard this term several times, especially in discussions about economics and so on, that about zero-sum games and so on. And that's exactly what is meant by this, that there's no win-win situation basically, but there's only a situation where the profit of one person immediately negatively affects the other person. This is basically called, because zero-sum game, so the sum is basically zero. And so if one gets a profit, something positive, the other one gets something negative, a loss. So in the end, it remains all zero. And this is really interesting and shows how this whole making decision works. And you can create many of such games, and you can try to figure out what is the Nash equilibrium. Is there a dominant strategy? Is there a Nash equilibrium? So because it turns out not always, not in every game there are Nash equilibria. In some games there are more than one Nash equilibrium, and also not every game has a dominant strategy. And so this makes things a lot more difficult sometimes. And what I also think is an example where you see this really interestingly is something from I think it's a British game show. And in the end of this game show, so in the beginning there are two people who play together, and they earn prize money and in certain games, and in the end they have a certain amount of the prize money, and then the last game decides basically what is done with this money that they earned by now. And this last game is called Golden Balls. So if you want to watch those videos or watch what this is all about, you can just type it in YouTube. There should be plenty of videos on this where different outcomes were shown. And it is basically built such that they can both decide whether they want to split the prize money or whether they want to steal it. So splitting would mean that both get 50% of the money, and stealing would mean that there it depends. If one person says I want to split the money and the other one says I want to steal the money, then the person who wants to steal the money will get all of it. However, if both persons decide that they want to steal it, then nobody will get the money. Then it will be all lost. And the funny thing about this is, if you game theoretically compute it through and look where are the Nash equilibria and so on, then you will see that the point where both are splitting is actually not a Nash equilibrium. This will not happen or should not happen. So what can happen is that both are stealing. This is the most likely version most times, or that one is splitting and the other one is stealing. Because you actually, if you say I want to split, or if you expect the other to steal, then it's not really a benefit for you to steal too. And if you then split, you don't gain something, you don't lose something. So this is also a Nash equilibrium. But the only thing that's not a Nash equilibrium is the one where both are splitting the pot. And if you watch the videos, because the funny thing about this is before they make the decision, they can basically talk to each other and assure themselves that they surely will split and that they will split because they are good people and so on and so on. And most of the times it turns out that one person was lying and did actually steal, or both were lying and were both stealing. So it's pretty nasty to some degree. But what's really interesting is because one person really gamed this game basically, and what he did is in this discussion where they before can talk about what they will do and how they want to engage this game, then he basically said, okay, we can I will steal. I will choose steal, and we can split the money right afterwards. So after the show, you come to me and I will give you 50%, but now I will steal, I will take everything, and then afterwards we can split it. But for this, you need to choose split, because if you choose steal, then it will all be lost. So please choose split, and I will steal, and then afterwards we split it up fairly. And the other one was, of course, arguing, hey, why are you doing this? Why not immediately split and be done with it, and then it's all nice and well? But he said, no, I will do it like this. I will steal and you can do what you want, but I urge you to split it, because then we can split it after the show. And then this other guy decided to go along and split it. And the funny thing was, the one who said he would steal also decided to split it. So they had this result, which was basically impossible because it's not a Nash equilibrium, and they achieved it by him changing a game a little bit, because what he did is he said, I will steal anyway, so you can decide whether I get all of it and possibly afterwards split it with you, which you are not assured of course, or whether you steal it and we all get nothing, and you all also don't have the prospect of later getting something. So in his mind it was, okay, if I steal it, I will for sure get nothing. But if I split, then I maybe get something. And so for him, this was basically a new dominant strategy, to split it, because there might be something that he get if he can trust this person to split it with him later. So he decided to split, and the other one, knowing basically that he would go this way because this was the best solution for him, split too. And so they had this new equilibrium. And I thought this was really interesting. This shows pretty much really in a really good way how game theory works. And so I encourage you to watch this. I think if you type in Golden Balls game show and so on, I think this probably will be the first video that pops up. So this is how basically the concept of game theory, and this is also not only in economics the case, although you might understand that there it is most present, because economy is mostly about individuals making decisions, and but it's also the case in natural sciences, but of course most present in natural science where decisions need to be made. So in this natural science of living things, meaning biology. And there it is especially important in evolutionary theory and or in the theory of evolution. And there, for example, one believes that the peacock, you know, peacocks, they have pretty beautiful feathers and so on. And this they use also in trying to get a partner. So the males try this to get a partner. And so they compete with their feathers for the best partner, and one thinks that this is also game theoretic to knock out the other partner and so on. So there's a lot of game theory theoretic discussions involved there, and also in many other areas in behavior between animals. There are certain situations where animal can benefit from helping each other, but also it would be an sacrifice for them to do so. And there's also game theoretic decisions if whether you help them or whether you let the other one help you and then betray them and so on. So there's a lot of this also involved in the natural sciences. So the games we discussed now were basically games where you make one decision and then it's over. So you can decide in the Golden Balls example, do you split or steal, and afterwards it's over. After the show, the people usually they did not know each other, so usually they don't ever meet again. Maybe sometimes on the street, but they don't meet in their circles, social circles. So if you would have been stealing and got away with all the money and betrayed this guy with whom you played, you would never, basically most likely never see him again. So you wouldn't care if he comes after you or if he holds a grudge or something like that. But the question is, what is if this is not the case? What if you have repeating games? What if you have this game repeatedly every day with the same partner, for example? You have to make the same assumption. Of course, you can then understand that the reaction in the next game of the one who you are playing with will depend on what you did before. He will, if you always betray him, he will at some degree don't trust you anymore and say, okay, not like that. And there, to understand this, one needs to go further and develop different game types, different strategies of playing repeated games. And this was, for example, also important during the Cold War. There, the Americans started with an institute, and they looked into the different types of games you can play or types of strategies that you can use, and try to find out what would be the most effective strategy. And there's, for example, you could basically just imagine some strategies you could use. Basically, let's say we play golden balls again and again and again. And you could say basically, okay, as long as the other one splits with me, then I will also split with him. But if he betrays me, then I will also betray him, and then I will not trust him anymore. I will betray him until the end, if there is an end. So this could be one strategy. One strategy could be, I will betray from the beginning and look how he reacts, or I will play along, I will split with him for some time, and then I will betray him and look how he reacts and betray him in a repeated cycle, or something like that. Or there are different strategies. One strategy would be to say, okay, I will act like he does. Basically, I will play along, I will split with him, and if he decides to steal, then in the next game I will steal too. If he then continues to steal, I will also continue to steal. If he says, okay, let's split, then in the next game I will again split, and so on. So you can try different types of games. And the last one I described, where you basically always react to what the other one did before and do the same, this is called tit for tat, because that's basically what it is. You do tit for tat. And this is, as they could show, in certain circumstances, this is the most effective strategy, that you always do tit for tat, that you will always say, okay, I will exactly do what you do after you did it, so I will always react in this way. And because this strategy is, of course, it's nice, because you start by trusting the other person. It's also forgiving, so you don't hold a grudge. So if he once betrayed you, you will betray him also once, or you will also retaliate. That's the second part. It's retaliatory. But after you retaliated, you will forgive. You will say, okay, now it's fine, and we can trust each other again. And it's also clear. Your proponent knows clearly what you are doing. He knows clearly, okay, he betrayed me now because I betrayed him. But if I start to go on trust again, then he will also trust me again. And this is really effective in certain scenarios. If the ones you are surrounded with, the players you are playing with, are all bullies, are all people who permanently try to betray you, then this, of course, is not really effective. But if you have, and this they could also show, if you have like a small bubble of people who play tit for tat and who are nice to each other and therefore help each other out, and are only surrounded with bullies who only want to betray you, then in the long run, those will come through, and the tit for tat players will, if you assume some mechanism by which they can expand, then they will expand further than the bullies, and will in the end be victorious. So if you consider this, and this has also often been considered to also be responsible for the coming into existence for the generation of social norms, of moral codes, and so on. And in a sense, that is the case. In some sense, you can consider it like this. You can consider it like a form of karma or something like this. But this only, of course, works if you really know that there are consequences. So some researchers found that it basically would only work if these social norms that you then postulate, that not only a large number of the society is committed to hold to these social norms, but also that they expect from a large number of the society that they will hold to it. Then you can expect something like this to occur. However, it's only as long as there are consequences. So this needs also to be the case, that there are consequences for these decisions, or consequences for people who defect, consequences for people who betray the trust of the others, and only as long as this is certain, as long as it is certain that there are no consequences, this will work out. And also, if you have a situation where there is no game after that, basically, then you will cannot have this hold up. So when they tried these different strategies, of course, in the last point of the game, so they had a finite number of games, and in the last point of the game, of course, they were always betraying, because why shouldn't you? Because you know that the other one cannot react to what you are doing. And this is a problem in this game. So they try to work around it by not letting them know how many games they were playing. But still, if you have a certainty that there won't be consequences, then you can always defect. And in this reasoning, you then always will be defect. And also you could have cases where certain players are not affected by your decision, where you can isolate your decisions from them, and then you can betray them as you like, and basically without any consequences. And this in society, you can see this maybe as the social weak persons, or the minorities, or people who can easily be exploited, and this could also occur there. So as you can see clearly, there is no way in which this morality that we observe today could only have come about by such game theoretic decisions or game theoretic emergences. To some degree maybe, but not to all degrees, because there are many games, if you would like it, maybe many decisions with which would not make game theoretic sense, where this cooperation would not even make sense. So especially also in religions, you have this, that there are decisions people make that you could not explain with such a game theoretic approach. For example, in Christianity, there are many, especially of the first Christians, but also many of the persecuted Christians today chose or were martyred. So, for example, in the Roman Empire, it was often demanded of Christians to abdicate their faith or meet their fate, basically, to meet martyrdom, and that's oftentimes what they chose. So why would they do this? How would this make sense if this moral codes are just game theoretic assumptions that were brought up? No, there has to have been a faith that this is the greater thing to do, the right thing to do, and a faith in doing the right thing, even if it leads to a result that is not leading to any profit for them. So this shows clearly that this cannot be the full explanation, and it's also, I think, luckily it shows that this cannot be the full explanation, because if you think of it, if this would be the sole reason why we act morally, then this would basically be not moral at all, because we would only act this way because something we do, some egoistical thing we do, could hunt us down later in the future. So if I betray a person, then I only abstain from doing this because in a later time he could take a revenge on me or something like this. So it in some areas, or for some people, this might be the case, but I think if this would not be moral. This would be basically acting out of fear of punishment, and this is not what one would call morality. And one might argue that especially in religions, some people act like this in fear of God, but actually if you look into what the faith teaches us, that's not what a Christian faith teaches, that we should be afraid of God and only act morally because we are afraid of punishment or something like that. No, actually Christianity teaches something completely different, and that by the work of Jesus Christ at the cross, that we are saved, that we have become new creations, and that this egoistical nature that this game theory shows that is there and that leads to these decisions, that this has been saved, has been redempted, and that we can live free from that, and then we can live in love, in the love that he gives us, and therefore make decisions that are not selfish, that are not egoistical, that are not just moved motivated by their own profit that one can gain, but only consider others, and also, as the Bible says, to consider our neighbor higher than ourselves, and so on. So this is a completely game changer, basically, if you want to say it like this. So and therefore this shows that I think moral cannot come from something like this. Some kind of moral, some kind of norms can come this way, but I would argue that those are not really good ones, because the motivation behind it is not rooted in doing good, in doing right, but it is rooted in being afraid of the consequences that might occur if I would do wrong. And even these consequences can also occur if you would do the right thing. The right thing can also lead to bad consequences for you personally. So this would not lead to moral decisions at all. It would be rather that is kind of a coincidence, would be kind of a coincidence that it would lead to, mostly to moral actions. But actually, real moral actions, real doing good and doing right, cannot come from such things, cannot come from such game theoretic considerations. So game theory might be great to describe the behavior among animals, or in some societies or some areas where there is not a high moral code, and where this emerges this way. But I think to really describe how morals come about, how it comes that we act morally, I think that's a much more spiritual question. And of course, if you only think that the materialistic way is the only thing there is, then of course you're stuck with trying to describe it in some way, and then game theory is basically the only thing to do it. But I think this shows that the materialistic world cannot be everything, because it cannot describe this thoroughly, and it needs a spiritual description of this, which can be found in religion. And I think in the Christian faith offers the best template for how we can really act morally, and in a way where we really do good out of a good nature, and not out of being afraid of the consequences of doing something wrong. Episode 30, Supersymmetry. So in this episode, we finally want to cover a topic that, at least on a German podcast, I was promising a long time, and I never would have thought that I actually would cover string theory before covering this theory of supersymmetry. I actually planned it to do the other way around, but it doesn't matter, and I want to talk about this now, about this theory behind it, because I found a nice thread where this was really nicely explained, a bit technical, but I try to explain it as easy as possible. And there are, so just to start, there are 10 symmetries that we know of in nature. And first, to understand this, we need to first understand what actually are symmetries, or what is meant by symmetries in physics. And if you read the blog post on my Substack, Sci-Faith.substack.com, there you can see that I think I made a blog post or several blog posts about symmetries in physics. And I also told you there that for every symmetry leads to a conserved quantity. But this is the Noether's theorem, and this basically states that if you have a symmetry in nature, then this leads to a conserved quantity like energy, momentum, and so on. But what are those symmetries? So in physics, the best way to explain it is a symmetry is something that if you change something in there, it remains the same. If you change some variable, if you transform it in any way, if you perform any operation and the equations of motion remain the same, then this is called a symmetry. So in mathematical language, this means that if the Lagrange function only changes with a time derivative, then this would mean that there is a symmetry occurring, because if you know analytical mechanics, for example, and if you would get equations of motion by using by variating basically the Lagrange function, which is basically differentiating, and in this way there would be a lot the time derivatives would vanish there, so nothing would those time derivatives would not affect the equations of motion. And this is basically the idea of a symmetry, that the equations of motions are not changed by this. And one example could be time translation. So the fact that it doesn't matter for most experiments at which time I do them. So if I let a ball, if I throw something out of my window and measure how long it takes to hit the floor, and I throw it out tomorrow at the same time, for example, then it will lead the same result. Although one day is between that. Of course, there can be different cases that the weather is differently and then something affects that. But let's assume this is all not the case. And therefore, this symmetry in time means that there is a symmetry in time because it doesn't change the effect of my experiment. And this symmetry in time actually is then connected to the conserved quantity of energy. So energy is conserved because there is a symmetry in time. And there are also other symmetries, and we have in science, or especially in quantum field theory, we are now talking about 10 or pretty much 10 symmetries that we know of. And there are 3 rotational symmetries, so they are along the space directions. And rotational symmetries always lead to conserved quantity in angular momentum. Then there are 3 boost symmetries. They are along 3 space-time dimensions. So boost symmetries are basically, this comes from the theory of relativity, and there we have different reference frames. And in this theory of relativity, it's the case that it should not depend on the reference frame. The science or the physics that actually happens should not depend at a reference frame. So it should not be depending on from where you observe the experiment or how much you move, how fast you move when you observe the experiment. This should not change what is physically happening. And this, of course, is also a symmetry. And those are called, because if you switch from one reference frame into another, mathematically, this is called a Lorentz boost, and therefore these are called boost symmetries. Then there are 4 translational symmetries along the 4 space-time directions. So you need to consider there are not only the 3 space dimensions, but also this one dimension, which is also considered the dimension of time. So you have 3 dimensions there, and those are also symmetries. And these symmetries, the collective of this symmetry is called the Poincaré symmetry. And as I have stated in the blog post, I discussed those symmetries several times, and I also made a connection with symmetries and conserved quantities, and also I made interpretation in the spirit, what this could mean spiritually, how we could interpret this according to the principle that the creation always reflects on the creator. And if you are interested in this, then I encourage you to read those blog posts. But now to get back to our what we are considering, the question now is there more? Are there more? Are those all the symmetries that we can find, or are there more symmetries that we could find there? And the answer that Coleman and Mandula gave, so the Coleman-Mandula theorem, gave this answer that under certain assumptions there cannot be any more than those symmetries. And those assumptions are basically that if you have some mass threshold, so some mass, and then if if lower than these mass, if you consider all the particles that are lower than this mass, so whose mass is lower than this mass threshold, then there should be a finite number of particles. If this is the case, and also if there are some more technical assumptions that particles will always react with each other at all energy scales, and that the amplitude of the scattering is depending in some way on the scattering angle. So again, a little bit more technical assumptions. But if those assumptions hold true, then there cannot be any more symmetries than those. However, there could some people or some researchers found that there are more indices, so more degrees of freedom basically, that you can consider. And in such a case, so before you would only consider these Lorentz indices that come from special relativity, and if you consider these other indices too, then there is more freedom in what you can actually do. Because with these indices, you will get generators. And these generators, what they basically do, so if you compute through what they are called, so the indices are called fermionic indices, and that's because those generators, they change the spin of a particle by 1/2. So what this means, for this we need to just look into what spin is and what this basically means. So spin you can consider kind of like an angular momentum of the particle, so its own angular momentum, although this is not really correct. That's not really, the particle is not really spinning, because if you would compute use the amount of the spin and you try to compute how fast it would be spinning, it would be faster than light, and also particles are considered to be point-like, so how could they revolve around themselves if they are just points? So this it does not really make sense, and it really is not at all possible to illustrate what spin really is or to understand it in any way. We can only mathematically describe it and say, okay, it's kind of like an own angular momentum of the particle, although it isn't, and so on. And those the spin can take different values, and there can be a full integer spin, so like 1, 2, 3, and so on. This can be a particle can have such a spin, or there can be half integer spin, like 1/2, 3/2, and so on. So those are the different kinds, and those particles then also behave differently. Because if you have a full integer spin, those particles are called bosons, and they can basically be in the same energetic state. So many bosons can be in the same energetic state. An example for a boson is, for example, the photon. Light particles are, for example, bosons, and all the mediators of forces are bosons. So gluons for the strong force, and so on. They are all bosons. And in contrast to that, there are the half integer spin particles, and those are called fermions, and they do not have this property. They cannot be in the same energetic state together. So there can only be one particle in this one energetic state, and this is the reason why in atoms electrons in atoms the electrons are on shells. They are not in the same energetic level. They each take a different energetic level, as you know from these shell models. It gets a bit more complicated there, but I won't dive into this. But that's basically the reason, and that's also then the reason why you can sit in your chair and not fall through it. Because what actually happens if you for example, sit in your chair, then the atoms in your back basically are pushing against the atoms in the chair. And what there on a molecular level happens is that the electrons are pushing against the electrons of the chair, and gravity basically tries to put them in the energetic levels of the chair, or even through them, but the electrons there are saying, no, I already am in this energetic state, and because of this Pauli exclusionary principle, as it is called for fermions, that they are not able to observe the same energetic level. Because of this, they repel each other, and this basically leads to you remaining seated in your chair and not falling through it. So as you can see, that matter is all made up of fermions, and that matter is made up of fermions is pretty important, because otherwise our world would look completely different. What now happens is, if you see this, okay, we said that we have these generators, and they take the spin of the particle and change it by 1/2. So now you know, if I have a fermion and I let this generator act on this fermion, then it will change this particle, its spin, by a factor of 1/2. So it will be, if it has, for example, a spin of 1/2, then it will afterwards will have a spin of 1. So then it will not be a fermion anymore, it will be a boson. On the other hand, if I do this with a boson, then it will have a half integer spin after this operation and will not anymore be a boson, but a fermion. So there is this symmetry that I get there, that I have a symmetry between a fermion and a boson. And there, for every fermion that I know, then I know that there is a boson that is connected to that, with similar properties. And so for every electron, for example, who are fermions, I have an S electron or selectron, how they then are called. You just put an S in front of this for the supersymmetry, and this is then a boson. And so for every particle that we know, there is a super partner. So, they are called a particle with an S in front of it that is if either a fermion or a boson, depending on what the other particle was. And the effect this has is that if you want to compute the amplitude of certain processes, of scattering processes in particle physics, then you always have these Feynman diagrams, which are basically tell you how to compute these amplitudes in a graphic way. And there it is the case that for fermions, you will always get a minus sign in front of the equation. And therefore, if you have a minus sign and a plus sign, they because the bosons, of course, still have a plus sign, the fermions have a minus sign, then they cancel each other out. And this is really important in something that is called renormalization. And there it is about the idea behind it is that you basically, in quantum field theory, the equations you make or the amplitudes you compute, if you compute them completely, they would tend to infinity. So you need some mechanism to get rid of those infinities. And how you do this is basically by absorbing these infinities into the constants, and also by, if you have these loop corrections, because for every amplitude, for every scattering, basically you can have amplitudes where there are loop corrections, you call them. So where an electron is produced, for example, or some particle is produced and annihilated again, which you cannot distinguish from the process where this does not happen. Therefore, you need to include all those loop corrections, basically, and they can make the result infinitely large. And to resolve this, you try to cancel those loop corrections against each other, which would look a lot like fine-tuning, like I set this constant in this loop correction such that I cancel it with that, and so on and so on. And this would look a lot like fine-tuning. I mean, in the end it works, you get the same physics and so on, but it's just not really aesthetically, it just looks like magic. And therefore, with this supersymmetry, you basically have the fact that those loops organically cancel each other, because by design they cancel each other, because there is this symmetry which leads to a minus sign that cancels these corrections, and therefore you get proper results and have this hierarchy problem, as it is called. You have this resolved by this theory, and therefore supersymmetry was a really promising theory for a long time, and to some degree still is, and there was a lot of research done on this. However, However, the problem was to confirm this theory experimentally. So after the LHC found the Higgs boson, which was basically the last part of the standard model, they tried to find other particles that could explain, for example, dark matter or different things, but also could confirm whether supersymmetry was indeed actualized in nature, or whether it was just a nice theory that solves the problems that our current theories seem to have. And as it looks now to some, it seems like the latter is the case, that it's just a nice theory, but still in principle it could be the case that supersymmetry will still be confirmed. However, the expectation was that it should have long been confirmed by now, because the energy spectrum in which one would have expected those particles to occur has pretty much been covered by the LHC. Of course, you can shift the parameters always such that they are in an area where we still have no measurements, but it increasingly seems improbable that this is the case. And as enthusiastic people initially were about supersymmetry, by now many people start trying new theories or go into new research areas. But still, of course, I don't want to call supersymmetry down or don't make it down. Maybe it will still be confirmed some days in the future, but right now the prospect of this seemed to me as an observer of this seemed to be pretty slim. As I already told you in the last episodes, I would like to give you short insights into my book, Alien Thoughts, my new novel that is out now. It's available on Amazon. So I would like to give you a short excerpt of it, that you can kind of see what the story is all about, what's the content, what is it, and if this is something you might be interested in. All right, let's start. All participants rose respectfully as Boris entered the room. "Be seated," Boris ordered, and sat down as well. "Hank is still busy, but will be here shortly to brief us on the situation." "Ah, here he is already." Hank entered the room. You could tell by the look on his face that he had been working without taking a break for the past few hours. His facial expression did not bode well. Patrizia had rarely seen him so tense. He was often very serious, but usually calm and relaxed. But not since she had alerted him to her discovery this morning. "I think it's best if Hank starts reporting on the state of affairs right away." Boris continued, giving Hank the signal to begin. "All right," Hank replied, pausing briefly, during which he connected his neurochip to the computer in the conference room. This allowed him to project from his chip to the screen. "This morning, Patrizia and I came across him when we were checking the logs of the refugees. Theodore Freeman. His new neurochip has the expected properties, but the neurochip he had implanted during his time in the rebel areas showed a period of time where the chip was nearly inactive and the fugitive was not subject to mind control." Patrizia was confused. Normally she would not interrupt a meeting like this, but she finally wanted to know what it all meant. She blurted out, "Wait a minute, the people in the rebel areas don't have neurochips implanted in them, don't they? That's why we don't have them under mind control, right?" There was a silence for a moment. Hank didn't know how to continue, and he looked inquiring at Boris. Boris nodded. "You can go ahead and fill her in. That's why she's here." If this excerpt caught your interest, I encourage you to get my book, Alien Thoughts, and to just read on what happened before, what will happen after this, and then I really would enjoy it if you could give me a review of what you've thought about the book. If you have already ordered it and read it, then I really would enjoy your feedback as well. So for this, you can either write a review on Amazon, which would be great because this always helps people other people who might be interested interested in this book to understand if this book is something for them and get feedback. But also you can write to me at my contact formula at my website sci-faith.de/en/contact. There you can contact me and write me what you think about the book and the feedback you have for me. Thank you. I really appreciate your support. And now let's continue with the podcast. Episode 31, Quark-Gluon-Plasma. A really interesting field of research, or something that is also tried to observe in hadron colliders or particle colliders in general, is the so-called Quark-Gluon-Plasma. What this is, we want to consider in this episode. So you might have heard it in several episodes again and again that there are these particles called quarks, which the protons and the neutrons are made of, and I also told you that that the protons are made of 2 up quarks and a down quarks. The neutrons are made of 2 down quarks and an up quark, so there are up and down quarks. But this is only one family of quarks. There are also 2 other families of quarks: the charm quark, the strange quark, the top quark, and the bottom quark. And except for the top quark, those particles hadronize. But the top quark is really, really heavy and therefore decays immediately, basically. And the other particles, they hadronize, which means that they build compositions of either 3 quarks or 2 quarks. Rarely, this could be observed in accelerators. There are also compositions of 4 or 5 quarks, so-called pentaquarks. And they could be observed, but in most times it's really a composition of 3 quarks like protons and neutrons, or 2 quarks. And the compositions of 3 quarks are called baryons, and the compositions of 2 quarks are called mesons. And those quarks are different in this way that they are participating in the strong nuclear interaction. So you might wonder, if you look at the atomic model, you might wonder how can an atomic nucleus, which consists of protons and neutrons, how can they hold together? Because if you look at it, protons are positively charged, so you would assume protons, they repel each other. So how can they hold together? So if you just continue to think it logically, then you would assume, okay, there needs to be some force which is stronger than the electromagnetic force which holds those particles together. And indeed, that's the case. This is the strong nuclear force, which is described by so-called quantum chromodynamics, and which basically states that there you have basically that the foundational particles are not the protons that you could measure in particle accelerators, that they are not point-like particles, but they have some form, they have constituents, and those you called quarks. And these quarks you consider to be elementary particles, and they participate in the strong interaction. And if we look back to electromagnetism, to atoms, electrons and protons, there you see protons are positively charged, electrons are negatively charged, and if they come together in an atom, then this charge is neutralized. Atoms are electrically neutral, and therefore the same occurs in quarks and hadrons. So basically, the individual quarks have a charge under this strong interaction, strong nuclear force, and this charge they bound together in these compositions, and in these compositions this charge is basically neutralized. So out of this core, out of a proton, this charge would not be present anymore. And those charges are different from the electrical charge, because if you look at the electrical charge, it's basically a one charge. So it's plus or minus, but basically plus and minus is only one coin of the charge. It's like charge and anti-charge, but only one part of it. And for this quarks, you have also a charge, but it's a color charge. Also, you describe it with colors because they are three ways. There are three charges basically. There is red, green, and blue. And you like plus and minus, you also have these anti-charges, and this is anti-red, anti-blue, anti-green. So you can try to imagine how anti-green would look like. You have to consider it such. Anti-green would look such that if you put it together with green, then you would get white. And this is basically this neutralizing effect of these color charges. And in baryons and mesons, this really occurs. So if you have this three composition of quarks, then they neutralize themselves in color by being red, green, and blue, and this will get white as a color, and therefore is neutral under these color charges. And if you have a meson, then you have basically the effect that you have a color and an anti-color, which basically leads to the same result, that they are neutral under these color charges. So now you might ask, okay, but if protons and neutrons are neutral under these charges, so how are these charges still, or these forces still acting in holding the atomic nucleus together? And this is just a side note. You have this also with atoms, that although they are electrically neutral, they are there's a dipole moment in these electrons because the charge is not evenly distributed in the electron, and therefore these charge fluctuations basically lead to a dipole moment, which also will have effects beyond the atom itself, which is basically the reason why atoms that have a certain temperature, or that have a temperature above zero, will radiate some form of radiation. And the same is happening in those protons. There's basically that these color charges are not uniformly distributed, and therefore there will also be something like the dipole moment with these electrical charges, which will have results further than those beyond the proton, and therefore will hold the protons together, although they are actually color neutral, so neutral in this strong force. So that was just a side note. What I also want to look into is, if we know electricity, and the way we know it is by certain effects where we can see electrical things occur, and also by the possibility to make atoms be charged. So to just kind of put an electron out of its atomic shell, and then the atom is then an ion basically, and this is a charged version. So there we can see these charges. So we can free up an electron from an atom, and this way we can separate charges and experience those electrical effects. And this does not work in the strong nuclear force. At least not at our energy. So because the reason is this is called quark confinement, and the reason for this is that if that this interaction between quarks, this strong interaction is really, really strong, and so if I try to pull, if I have, for example, let's say I have a meson, a part of quark and anti-quark, and I really try to pull them apart, like I would pull an electron out of an atom and free it up. I would try to do this with quarks, and I would put a much high force on it and pull them apart. But in difference to the electrical force, where the interaction gets weaker as farther they are apart, in the strong interaction it's really getting stronger. So the more I pull them apart, the more energy is between them, and at some point they will just out of the vacuum, a particle and the antiparticle, a quark and an antiquark pair will be produced, which make those two particles that I try to separate, make them two mesons again. So I will not be able to free them up. So there are no free quarks in nature, while we have free electrons in some parts of nature, and they can be in nature. That's not a contradiction, but there are no free quarks in nature, and they can therefore not be observed freely. However, there is this case where you have this, you call it asymptotic freedom, and this occurs because the coupling, which is basically the charge between between particles, is dependent on the energy. So this is also true for the electromagnetic force, but for the electromagnetic force, this effect is really not that high, so you would not immediately observe it. But for the strong interaction, this effect is really, really high. And the more energy you have, the higher the energy is, the lower this coupling gets. So if at really, really high energy, this coupling basically vanishes. This is called asymptotic freedom. So when the energies are really, really high, then basically this coupling, this color charge, this strong interaction is not there anymore. You can assume it's of course there, but the coupling is not strong anymore. Is basically vanishing, and so it's they behaving like they would be freely, but like this charge would not exist, and this occurs at really, really high energies. And since high energies are also means short distances, this means that in a proton itself, this is occurring. So in a proton, you have these quarks rather moving around freely, because it's so close that their energies are so high that this asymptotic freedom is achieved, and they move freely inside of this proton. But to get it in a larger scale, you would need to have this energy acting on them. So would need a really, really high energy, and it is and then they would move freely. And as I have stated, this is the strong interaction, and as you know from the electromagnetic interaction, there is an exchange particle, which is the photon. So similarly, in the strong nuclear force, you have this exchange particle, which is the gluon. And the gluon is very similar to the photon, except that the gluon itself can carry charge, so color charge, which the photon does not. The photon does not carry electrical charge. This changes things up a bit, but for our purposes, you can consider it like the photon for the strong nuclear force. So just the mediator of this force. And if you now have this asymptotic freedom, this high energy where the coupling basically vanishes, then you have these quarks and gluons basically freely with another in a substance, basically a plasma. So you have basically this Quark-Gluon-Plasma, kind of like an own phase in which they are together. And it is assumed that shortly after the Big Bang, this was present there, that there was this Quark-Gluon-Plasma, because if you consider the Big Bang theory, there in a certain microseconds after the Big Bang, there of course was a lot of energy in a condensed place, and there was of course this the energy was so high that such a Quark-Gluon-Plasma could occur, and therefore it is assumed that this was present in this part of the Big Bang. Also, it is, as I said in the beginning, in current research, it is really a goal to achieve such a Quark-Gluon-Plasma, even for very short periods of time, in a detector, in a particle accelerator. And the reason for this is, of course, that this allows you to investigate matter in extreme conditions, and of course to get insights in how the Big Bang might have looked, especially in this beginning seconds or microseconds where there is really not, which is still a topic of research, because there is not a lot known about these beginning the beginning periods of the Big Bang. And what you understand then, if you just consider such a Quark-Gluon-Plasma, then you know the energies have to be really, really, really high, and really high means that the particles are moving really, really, really fast. And if the particles are moving really, really fast, then you know that maybe relativistic effects are occurring there. And indeed, this is the case. So these are highly relativistic particles, and this leads to really high magnetic fields. Why is this the case? So if you consider electromagnetism, then you will see that the reason why we have magnetism, or what magnetism basically is an affected and relativistic effect of electricity. Because if you know magnetism basically occurs if charges are moving charges basically lead to a magnetic field. But if you now consider the theory of relativity, where it states that no matter what movement you have, the physical reality should be the same, then the question is, what if I move in the same speed as those charges in their reference frame basically? Then basically to me those charges will not move. So in this reference frame I should not see a magnetic field. But in a reference frame where they are moving relatively to me, I should see a magnetic field. But still the physics should be the same. And how to resolve this is basically to transfer these equations from this just electric field in the rest frame of the charges to this different rest frame, and then I see that this electrical field becomes a version of an electric field and some magnetic field. So magnetism actually is a relativistic effect. So if I have highly relativistic particles that are really moving fastly, then of course this immediately will lead to really high magnetic fields. And this was achieved in an experiment recently, where they achieved for a really short time to establish such a Quark-Gluon-Plasma, and then build such high magnetic fields. And this was indeed the strongest magnetic field of the world in the universe. It is assumed to have been, but of course it was only for a really, really short period of time. They had even trouble to measure that this magnetic field really occurred. So they did not even measure the magnetic field itself, but the effect the magnetic field in this short period that it existed had. And therefore it was of course no danger or nothing like that, but it was an interesting fact that this highest magnetic field in the universe could be produced in such an extreme experiment, also although for a really, really short period of time. So it was just a really really small fraction of a second where this magnetic field was present. So I think there are several ways to interpret these results, also not only in the materialistic, but also in the spiritual, and according to the principle that the creation always reflects on the creator. And especially this part of quark confinement that I was describing in the first part of this episode, as I already also write in my book, this can be nicely related to the Trinity itself, because you have, as you might remember in these hadrons, you have these baryons, which are compositions of three quarks who are really strongly bound together. So you can see this as an illustration of the Trinity and how strongly they are together. They are together and they cannot be separated from one another. You cannot just say this is God and this is not God. No, they are one. They are one in their Godhead, and so this can be an image on this. And also, if you then look to the mesons, then you can see this as an illustration of the covenant of marriage between man and woman, basically of this quark and anti-quark. And also you can see this in itself, since in the Bible, marriage is often considered to be itself an image on Christ and his relationship to his church, where the church is considered to be the bride and he the bridegroom. So you can consider this also as an image on that. So this, I think, is a really powerful illustration that we can find in nature of spiritual concepts, which I think is really fascinating. And what I think also, if you look at this specific experiment where they established this Quark-Gluon-Plasma and these high energies were set free and this high magnetic field was released, I think you can see this also in this interpretation of asymptotic freedom. So first of all, you can see asymptotic freedom also in this Trinity picture, you can see it that although they are strongly bound together and they hold as a unity together, inside of it, like inside of a proton where they can move freely, they can also move freely. So they are not bound in a sense that they are chained, that they cannot move freely anymore. But they are bound together in a way that holds them together, but still in this they are really free. And I think in the same way you can consider it in a healthy marriage to be the case that while you are really bound together as a unity, as Scripture also said, you are still free in this unison. So there's this. It might sound contradictory, but there is this relation between freedom and also being tied to being together, being in a covenant, which might look like a contradiction. But here in this image, you see it together, and you see how this can in nature work out together, and therefore also in this spiritual sense work together. And if you then continue to look on this, if you are in this unity, then you can see it also. This releases in this Quark-Gluon-Plasma, this releases high magnetic fields. So it leads to an attraction. So a magnet is always an image of an attraction. Something gets attracted like a magnet attracts iron and so on. So this can be seen that if you are in this unison with each other, then there is an attraction. It's attractive and it attracts, and therefore it has a magnetic effect. So this is really an interesting interpretation, I think, and really encouraging that we know that the more we come together, that we come as one, also as Christians and as the body of Christ, the more this magnetic attraction can basically be released. Episode 32. Why can you hear the ocean inside of a seashell? So this is a popular myth or popular experience that, especially as children, you might have had, that if you when you have a shell, or especially those bigger shells that you might have found on vacation or bought there, and you pick them up to your ear and you listen to it, you hold it closely and you listen to it, it sounds kind of like you would be hearing the ocean inside of there, the waves and of the ocean waves coming to the shore and so on. And the question is how that is. You might think, the ocean is still in this shell, there's some connection or something. No. Of course, we know that this is not the case, but we want to look into what is the physical effect behind it. Why does it seem like you would hear the ocean inside of such a shell? And it's basically not only in a shell, but in any kind of object like this, like a cup of, if you take your teacup and you hold it to your ear, you will observe a similar effect. So this is, as you might have has nothing to do with the sea, with the ocean, but it has something to do with something similar, but not really similar. So for this, we need to understand more about waves. So, and in this podcast, I think I several times mentioned waves, and especially in contrast to particles in quantum mechanics, you have this wave-particle duality and so on. But this is basically two ways to describe objects in science. The one is, of course, particle-like objects like marbles or stones or what have you. But on the other hand, there are things like sound, for example. Yeah, you don't see it, you don't. Also, you can hear it from several places. It's not just one object at one place. You can have something like an echo. If you are in the mountains and you scream really loud, you can hear it echoing back and so forth. So this behaves kind of differently than those marbles and those stones that you know of. So to understand what those are, you need to understand what waves are. So because they are waves, they are not these object-like objects, but they are waves. And as waves are different than those objects, there are different effects, of course, occurring. So you can just imagine a wave just like the waves you see at sea, kind of somewhat similar, but they are more periodically than the waves you would usually see. They have a period, a time from start to beginning, and then they will periodically repeat themselves. And this is the length of this period is their wavelength. And inversely to this is, of course, the frequency. So basically, the how often such a wave occurs, and how often this repeats itself, basically, and how fast it goes. So they have these different properties. And what's the most defining thing that changes from particles to waves, as we also have observed in our observations of quantum mechanics, is that there is this effect of interference occurring. So we had this oftentimes of this interference pattern that occurs in quantum mechanics, and this is I would say one of the main differences that waves have. And this is because a wave can basically expand into all directions, but if it hits a wall or something, then it will get reflected. You know this from many things that are considered to be waves, like light. If it hits a mirror, it will be reflected, or a sound. I was speaking about this echo. This is basically that the sound is reflected at a barrier and returned back to you. And what can happen if this sound is or these waves are reflected, or what will happen is that they will meet each other. The incoming wave will meet the reflected wave, and this can lead to interference, or will lead to interference. And what this means is that whenever a peak of the wave and two peaks of the wave, so of the reflecting and the incoming wave, the peaks match and the troughs match, then this will increase the wave amplitude, and they will be doubled, basically. And whenever they are not in this synchronicity, but are anti-synchronicity, basically, so a trough is meeting with a peak and a peak with a trough and so on, then they will destructively interfere, which means they will basically go to zero. And so this effect is called interference, and this will have certain effects. And if you have a closed environment, so just like a shell would be, if you hold it to your ear, then it is closed up. There is nothing getting in or out. Then the waves in there will be pulled back and forth, will basically be reflected and so on. And in such a case, there will be only they will interfere each other out over a longer period of time, or not a longer, it will happen pretty quickly, but basically they will interfere each other out. But what only will remain are so-called standing waves, and those are waves whose wavelength fits with the length of the resonator, or of the object in which they are. What I mean by that is that the length of the resonator is a multiple of the wavelength itself. So when the wave walks through it, it will, at the ends of this object, it will always be at the same point, and therefore it will not interfere each other out, but it will get to such a standing wave. So it will go back and forth, but there won't be any interference, because it will basically be the same wave, because it will be always in synchronicity. And this is what's called a standing wave. And because each frequency of, we are looking at sound right now, so each frequency has its or each tone of sound has its own frequency. So only certain frequencies will have this wavelength, which would be a multiple, or where this length of this object would be a multiple of. So therefore, not all of the sound that gets into this shell will be able to remain in there, but be due this effect of interference will be removed. But certain frequencies will be able to stay in there because they are just the right wavelength. And this is actually the effect that occurs there. So if you put your ears to such a seashell or some other object, then you will basically hear the sound that is able to maintain in there, that is able to build standing waves in this object. Hence, you can consider such a seashell or such an object like a filter of ambient sound. So it's ambient sound, the sound you have in your surrounding, that is where certain frequencies are filtered out by this. If you know about music, then you maybe also know that there are also overtones. So for one wave, you can, for example, have an half of this wave, which is basically just this wave halved, which would be the first overtone, and this would you would call 1/2, and then the next one 1/3, and so on. And this is actually also a series in mathematics, which is called the harmonic series, which is basically you take 1 plus 1/2 plus 1/3, and so on, and you sum them all up. This is a series which will diverge, so it will tend to go to infinity. But the interesting thing is, if you put this graph on a graph and you graph all those overtones, basically, then you will see that this is really similar to the shape of a shell, so of a seashell, of a certain seashell. This is really almost the same. So there is a picture that went through social media where this was shown, where there's an X-ray photo of a seashell was shown, and also this graphic representation of this harmonic series, which also has this connection to music. And there you can see how similar this is to each other, which also explains why this effect of hearing the sea or hearing this noise of this ambient noise, which is filtered, as we have explained, or as I have just explained, why this is in seashells seems to be more present than like in a teacup, and therefore this might be related to that. And on this picture, this was subtitled, or there was this quote from supposedly Pythagoras, where he said, "Physical matter is music solidified." So this should be a representation of the statement that physical matter is music solidified, so materialized, or music basically will be then seen in physics. And I think this was pretty similar to what I oftentimes have, the statement that I oftentimes have in essence on this podcast, where I basically say that the creation always reflects on the creator, where it basically says this, that the creator is itself reflected in nature, in creation, as it also says in Romans 1:20, that we can basically find God in nature. So we find his traces in nature, and therefore can understand that he has indeed created the world. This was freely paraphrased, but now what I've immediately thought about this, because what is music, or if we look in the biblical sense, what is music always related to? It's always related to worship, or also to the word of God. And the word says that God created this world through his word. And therefore, by speaking into this world was created. So seeing that this music seems to be integrated, or this word seems to be integrated in such things like the seashell, like in this post there, I think this is just an illustration, or just an image on the fact that God indeed created the world through his word. And I already mentioned this relation between, of course, music and worship, and this is always I think this also shows that all creations is longing to worship its creator, to worship its Lord and creator, as Jesus also said in the Gospels when the Pharisees were rebuking the Jews for worshiping Jesus, and where he said, if they don't worship me, the stones will cry out. So he basically implies here that all of creation longs for the worship of God, or longs to worship God, and therefore this is, I think, also can also be seen here that in creation itself, this is implemented, is put in, and this we can see also with this image. This I found really fascinating, and found a really fascinating fact about seashells and their connection with music and worship. So that's everything for today's episode. I hope you liked it and you enjoyed each part of it. If you want to get in touch with me or discuss a topic or want to give me some feedback, then feel free to contact me using the contact form on my website, sci-faith.de/en. And there you can go to the contact tab and contact me. And if you have any other things or episodes you want to have covered there, or topics you want to have covered, feel free to contact me there. Also, if you are not yet familiar with the format in which this podcast is produced, let me just briefly explain it to you. So there is always at the beginning of a month or of a block, there is a big block of 4 episodes in one thing. It's kind of like a preview, which I call it, where you have the next 4 episodes all in one episode together, combined. And this is for people who like to hear long format podcasts, who have a long way to work or something else, where they can listen to a long episode and can then have a preview of the next 4 episodes all at once, and are completely up to date from the beginning of the block. For those who like their episodes shorter, who prefer it if they have a half an hour or even less of a podcast episode, for those there is every week afterwards will appear a podcast episode almost in that length, and this way I can publish every week a new podcast every episode, and everyone can have it his own way, either once a month a long chunk of content, or once a week a shorter format podcast episode. So I think that's the best way for everyone, and also for me when I'm producing it. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means that it is recorded, produced, and marketed by me. So I really need your support in this. So if you like this podcast, then give it a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, even write a review to it. This just helps other listeners to become aware of this podcast, and then people who might be interested in this content can become aware of it. Also, if you have friends who you think would like this content, then recommend it to them and share it with them. Also, you can support me in other ways, for example by reading my blog and subscribing to my newsletter, or even by reading my books, which you can find on Amazon. For example, there is my latest novel out now is Alien Thoughts, which is pretty entertaining from the feedback that I gotten, and so it's also in some way related to science and faith. The topic of it is also in there, but of course you can also read the book to this podcast, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is also available in English since last year. Thank you for that, and now I wish you a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward for you to tune in again next time.